There has never been a more enigmatic and paradoxical piece of content in the Final Fantasy series than Final Fantasy XI Wings of the Goddess. The legacy this expansion left behind is most certainly not a good one among many 11 fans. This expansion has long been the punching bag of sorts among the Final Fantasy XI expansions. Many players I talked to when I was still considering starting this game would often tell me that this was the worst of the expansions, and anytime anyone did an expansion ranking for this game, Wings of the Goddess always came out on the bottom. The community's disdain for this expansion might not be uncalled for either. From the time of the expansion's release on November 20th of 2007 to the final add-on of Abyssea released on December 7th of 2010, a full 3 years and 3 months, Wings of the Goddess had never finished its main story. This span of time was longer than any previous expansion's life cycle, and players never got to play through the expansion's narrative for that time. The story wasn't the only thing that took its time coming out either. The expansion did not offer players a complete gameplay loop nearly as rewarding as the previous expansions until after the add-ons came out. To top this off, any of the Treasures of Adargon content that players were looking forward to were constantly having resources siphoned away from them for Wings of the Goddess. Upon the expansion's release, it had very little story, no new zones, and almost no new gameplay content, leaving many players confused as to where those resources had gone. While this expansion wasn't directly responsible for many of the foundational changes that classic players claimed killed the game, it was the current expansion when many of these changes were made. On February 28th of 2010, 3 new add-ons were announced, collectively referred to as the Abyssea add-ons. Abyssea was meant to add a whole new story to Final Fantasy XI, give another set of reskinned zones with new and interesting mechanics, and most importantly, raise the level cap from 75 to 99. While on paper, raising the level cap of an MMO might seem to give the game more endgame content for players to do, in practice, this raising of the level cap made rewards from the previous 3.5 expansions worth of content far inferior to what the Abyssea add-ons rewarded. For endgame players, they went from having 7 years of relevant content to a fraction of what they were accustomed to, and many of the accomplishments they'd spent years working towards were completely invalidated. Because of how easy these Abyssea zones made leveling, there were a whole new subset of players hitting max level who never learned the combat system or how to play their job. In the minds of many, this completely changed the social dynamic of the game for the worse. This sluggish release schedule and the game-changing add-ons did not go unnoticed by the players of the time. All of this facilitated the biggest exodus that the game had ever seen. Now, whenever Wings of the Goddess is mentioned, this mishandling of Final Fantasy XI in that time period casts a shadow so opaque, the finer qualities of the expansion never shine through. So what is it like to play this catastrophe of an expansion today? What is Wings of the Goddess like for modern players? See, that's the confusing thing. Wings of the Goddess is a masterpiece. It has, in my opinion, the very best story 11 has to offer. It has the most engaging gameplay loop of any of the pre-modern expansions, and it very well might be the crowning achievement of the 11th entry of the Final Fantasy series. The legacy that Wings of the Goddess leaves for modern players far surpasses what the expansion ever was in its own era, and if this confuses you, well, you aren't the only one. After I finished the missions of the expansion and began playing through its related content, I had to look back at what was said about the expansion because I could not believe all of the negativity surrounding it. Full transparency, back when I decided to start working on these expansion reviews and got to work on the Rise of the Zilart video, Wings of the Goddess was the expansion I was most looking forward to talking about. This is because the juxtaposition between the catastrophe that this expansion was for 11 in its own time and the masterpiece it has become over the years led me to discovering the truth about Wings of the Goddess. The little-known truth that I haven't heard a single person mention about this expansion. a truth that has eluded 11 players and Final Fantasy fans for 16 years and counting. And in this video, I hope to make this truth known for all to see. You may want me to cut to the chase and tell you what it is outright, but I can't do that. You see, dear viewer, even if I tried, it wouldn't make any sense. Not yet. For it to make sense, you first have to learn 4 things about this expansion. When I mentioned Wings of the Goddess is the most enigmatic and paradoxical piece of content in the series, that's because all 4 of these things you need to learn about can be described as a paradox in their own right. But once you've learned each of these paradoxes, only then will you be ready to learn the truth of Wings of the Goddess. This expansion had the worst narrative experience the Final Fantasy series has ever given players. As mentioned before, it took 3 years and 3 months for the story of the expansion to conclude, losing the interest of tens of thousands of players across that time. To put that time period into perspective, there was a bigger gap between the release of Wings of the Goddess and the conclusion of its story than there was between the release of Chains of Promathia and Wings of the Goddess. Players who were finishing up their first year of high school when the expansion came out would be applying to colleges or getting ready for their first full-time job by the time it was wrapping up. And unsurprisingly, it is impossible for that type of story to keep an audience's attention over a period that vast. Despite having the worst narrative experience, Wings of the Goddess, in my opinion, has the very best narrative that the game has to offer. And this is the first thing you need to learn about the expansion. The story opens up with the adventure happening across an old statue of sorts. The statue comes to life and pulls him into a portal. The adventurer finds that he's been taken into a strange place where time has seemingly stopped, and the mouth of a giant creature whose body is obscured looms over the entire world. Before he can find his bearings, he is forced out of this strange place, where he awakens to find that he's traveled 20 years into the past. The story is structured around 2 different plots. The first of these plots depends on the nation you give your allegiance to, between Sandoria, Bastok, and Windurst. I found that each of these 3 stories are incredibly solid on their own right. Sandoria's story focuses on a group of young children and their involvement in the Crystal War. Exenmil and Rahal are main characters of the story, and you'll have met them as adults if you spent any time doing the nation missions and quests for Sandoria. I usually have an aversion to children in wartime stories, because it's difficult to include children in these stories without making the stories feel either unnecessarily dark or unintentionally whimsical. While this story suffers slightly from both of these issues, I was ultimately surprised at how well it pulled this type of plot off. The story takes these children and puts them through horrible enormities that forces them to grow up and become knights. It does all of this without ever feeling grimdark in its tone, even if it does feel a bit silly at times. Whenever I hear this piece that you're listening to right now, I can't help but think about all of these children and everything they've gone through. Funny enough, this is also the second phenomenal coming-of-age story in the Sandoria nation of Final Fantasy XI, as the original nation missions for Sandoria have similar themes, but with Tryon and Piaget. Bastok's story focuses on the civil unrest between the Humes and the Galka. There are a subset of Humes that treat the Galka horribly, and in response, some of the Galka in turn try to revolt in the midst of a straining conflict with the Beastmen. I've heard many say that this story is far weaker than any of the other 2, but I disagree. I did find that because the story focuses on the internal states of Bastok, much of the story early on fails to convey the severity of war, and when it tries to later on, it feels a bit disjointed. Regardless, this is also the only story that focuses on a couple characters we know really well from the original Nation missions. Seeing these characters fleshed out even more during the Crystal War era is truly a treat. The story in Windurst best conveys just how horrible this war is. For those who have played the original Windurst story missions, it should be no surprise that the story heavily involves the terrestrial avatar Fenrir. This story tells of the events leading up to its summoning, and it revolves around two key characters. The first is Roble Arkbel, an already mysterious warlord who has been acting even more strange since the war started. His character design is a great nod back to the original design of black mages in the first Final Fantasy also. The second is Leko Hubhoka, a devious male Mithrod who has appeared to help the warlord in his war efforts. This narrative in particular twists and turns in so many unexpected directions that it's hard not to feel that this is the strongest of the three. It isn't surprising then that the Winder's Path has become a fan favorite among the three, and is the go-to suggestion for new Wings of the Goddess players. But I strongly recommend sticking to whichever nation you've already achieved rank 10 in. None of these stories are so far better than the others to justify losing out on seeing the characters you're familiar with, but 20 years younger and during the Crystal War. It is unfortunate that players only get to experience one of these stories at a time. Some of the very best character writing in the game is done in these nation stories. Roble Arkbel is one of the most interesting characters in the entire game. Exenmill's development from a child to a knight was incredibly moving, and the fleshing out of Zyde's character are some of the highest highs in this expansion, and most people will only get to see one of these. Thankfully, however, phenomenal character writing isn't just limited to these nation plots, though. The primary storyline of Wings of the Goddess is woven through the nation story you choose to play. It tells of a young girl, Lillicet, who you eventually find has also traveled back in time 20 years as you have, but with the intention of saving her father who died from a wound he sustained during the war. Another key character is Cait Sith, an avatar created by Altana to keep the Crystal War from destroying the enlightened races. The adventurer, Cait Sith and Lillicet eventually find themselves working together to stop a nefarious group of people who have also traveled back in time to shape the future in the way they most desire. And in this conflict, we have the best villain in Final Fantasy XI, Lady Lilith, leader of the Spite Wardens. I really don't want to give too much more away on this story, because the less you know about the story, the more enjoyable it winds up being. But I do want to elaborate on a few key things. Lady Lilith is among the best characters in Final Fantasy XI, and certainly among the best villains in the Final Fantasy series. As the story unfolds, her intentions become more and more relatable, and she also has the sense of presence that villains like Kefka or Arden have. Every time she's on screen, she has the audience's attention, and the hero-villain dynamic between Lillicet and Lady Lilith is the best hero-villain dynamic in the entire series. And yes, I say that even being a big fan of Final Fantasy VII. The expansion takes all of the main characters and fleshes them out in a way that leaves every single one lovable, multidimensional, and relatable. The expansion also incorporates my favorite obscure Final Fantasy summon, Atamos, into its lore. While I don't want to spoil what exactly his role in the story is, it is among the most interesting plot ideas I have ever seen in a Final Fantasy game. This main story is by far the strongest in the expansion, and even in the game, in my opinion. While it isn't perfect, as certain plot elements seem a bit unstable towards the end, the story does take the grandeur of Chains of Promathia and unifies it with the polish that was present in Treasures of Atargan to create a narrative that stands out even among the incredible roster of stories in both Final Fantasy XI and the Final Fantasy series. And this is the first paradox you need to know about Wings of the Goddess. It had the worst narrative experience of any Final Fantasy XI story, but possibly the best narrative the game has ever seen. There is a lot to discuss regarding the gameplay content, so before we go there, let's talk about the second thing you have to understand about Wings of the Goddess. This expansion's soundtrack is both the happiest and the saddest soundtrack in all of Final Fantasy. I'm not saying that it contains some of the happiest and saddest pieces. I mean, many of the pieces in the soundtrack are both at the same time. And this is the second paradox of Wings of the Goddess. For starters, this expansion's music is the beginning of the best of XI's music, in my new player opinion. Just like Rise of the Zilart and Treasures of Ottergon, it has both a strong melody for every track, and these pieces fit the ambience and use case phenomenally. What this soundtrack does differently, however, is that almost every piece is written to convey the juxtaposition between the desperation and hope that serves as the central theme for this war story. Many of the pieces, such as this piece you're listening to right now, start with a large soundscape to convey the tragedy of a battlefield. This goes along with the tragedies taking place all around the world, from the hundreds of deaths in what is now called Davoy, to the young children forced into a war and conflict. The desperation in this music perfectly fits the tragedies contained within the story. They demonstrate the desperation of death and the enormity of bloodshed. As the piece unfolds, however, the soundscape becomes more enclosed and intimate feeling as the melody gives way to a happy and hopeful disposition for several solemn moments. In this case, it keeps the same tonic, but switches the scale from a minor to a major one, reflecting the opposite of everything the rest of this desperate piece conveys. After a brief moment of cheerfulness, the piece switches back to a minor scale before slowing and fading. And in case you were wondering, this piece of music is called Flowers on a Battlefield. I wholeheartedly agree with the sentiment that all of 11's music is underrated. Of all of the soundtracks in Final Fantasy history, 11's is by far the most deserving of that title. But if there is one soundtrack in particular in this game that is more underrated than the rest, it is most certainly Wings of the Goddess. It made bold steps towards better conveying the atmosphere of the expansion beyond even what its predecessors did, but it is rarely ever singled out for these accomplishments. This is probably because of the campaign music that plays in a zone when a type of battle content called campaign is currently underway there, which feels like a majority of the time by the end of the expansion. The first 3 hours you spend listening to this music is nothing short of epic. Every moment after those first 3 hours is monotonous at best though. Regardless, this soundtrack is among the very best this game has to offer, thanks to the duality that every track contains in one way or another. By the time Wings of the Goddess came out, Final Fantasy XI was 5 years old. This might not sound like much of a jump by today's standards. Plenty of 5-year-old games still look and run great today. But a 5-year difference in the mid-2000s was substantial. Between the time of 11's release and Wings of the Goddess, a whole new console generation was underway. Naughty Dog went from having just finished Jak and Daxter to wrapping up the first Uncharted, and almost 3 classic Halo games came out in that time. The gaming industry wasn't the only thing to change in this time period though. Many of the high schoolers who were playing Final Fantasy XI upon its release, or beginning to take on college workloads or full-time jobs like I mentioned earlier, the Final Fantasy XI player base was growing up and they didn't have the free time they once did. If there was any expansion that needed to modernize 11 or offer a modernized, streamlined gameplay loop in a way that preserved player accomplishments, it was most certainly Wings of the Goddess. This expansion did exactly none of this, though. Rather than offering new, streamlined forms of content, the gameplay loop that it did have was borderline non-existent compared to the previous expansions, for the first couple years anyway. Square Enix eventually did take steps towards modernizing the game, allowing much of the content to be soloed, but the first modernizing steps were taken through the add-ons of Abyssea, a full 3 years after the expansion came out. This meant that the purchase of Wings of the Goddess would not include any of these features. The modernizing they did do for the game certainly wasn't to the liking of many 11 players either. While the reception and reaction to Abyssea is too complex to delve into for this video, what no one would argue with is many of the accomplishments these older players spent years working towards were completely invalidated. Relic weapons and mythic weapons were the best weapons in the game right before the Magian trials came out, and they took months of active playing or mind-boggling amounts of gil to make. However, when the new Empyrean weapons were added, they could be made significantly stronger in only a couple hours of playing. All of the 75 armor that had once taken months to achieve were now replaceable, and there was a new generation of players getting to max level who simply didn't know how to play the game, which, as I mentioned, made the social breakdown caused by the Abyssea content that much worse. Wings of the Goddess failed to modernize Final Fantasy XI, but from a new player's perspective, this is the best, most modern-feeling 75-era expansion to play through. Over the years, many of the extra content pieces from every expansion have been modernized somehow, such as getting currency in Dynamis, or having eye-level gear in Limbus, and summoning alter egos in most of this content. Despite this, I found the difficulty of the battle content in previous expansions to be really all over the place. The difficulty difference between Dreamworld Dynamis and Limbus are leagues, and this goes on through all of the battle content before this point. This isn't a bad thing either. The inconsistent difficulties just require strategizing and preparation, which I greatly enjoy. But it does make all of the older battle content feel fragmentary. Wings of the Goddess is the first time from a new player's perspective, where all of the content feels to be relatively stable in difficulty, which I greatly appreciated. The majority of the story has one set difficulty, and certain related battle content feels comparable. The final boss of the epilogue quest steps the difficulty up considerably, and so too do some of the newer content additions. Almost none of the connecting content pieces stray too far from this range. This is also the first expansion that has a story boss that forces players to strategize. I lost to the final boss of the epilogue quest multiple times. Each time I made tweaks to the rotation of abilities I would use, the skill chains I initiated, and the spells I prioritized until I found an approach that allowed me to win with little struggle. While the boss wasn't difficult by this game's standards, it was the first time a story boss had a level of difficulty that was actually rewarding. And this is the third paradox you need to understand. The one expansion that failed to modernize the game is the most modern-feeling expansion from that era. Before moving on, however, the mistakes 11 made in trying to modernize itself warrants a closer inspection. As mentioned before, players during the Wings of the Goddess era and Abyssea era of 11 were leaving in numbers the game had never seen before that point. Many players blame Wings of the Goddess for the downfall of 11, but I don't think it's that simple. This expansion got almost no new content for years, and when the game did receive new content, it either required an additional purchase, it invalidated much of what players had worked towards, or both. Why did this happen? There are two commonly cited culprits. The first is the developers working at the time. Half of the dissatisfied 11 players claimed that the incompetence of the development team was what ultimately killed the game. This claim may also have some merit. The dev team did make an unbeatable boss and blamed bad players for not beating it, and they made plenty of strange decisions in this era of 11 as well. The second culprit players point to is Final Fantasy XIV. In 2009, Square Enix announced a game called Rapture. This new MMO began drawing on the resources generated by 11, and in the lead-up to the eventual release under the name Final Fantasy XIV, 11 got fewer and fewer content additions. Eventually 14 came out, and Square even tried to funnel 11 players into Final Fantasy XIV. While both of these arguments may be perfectly legitimate in many ways, there is one thing that few people ever reference when this topic comes up. World of Warcraft had released its second expansion, Wrath of the Lich King, just 1 year after the release of Wings of the Goddess. This was an all-time high for WoW, reaching a subscriber count of 12 million players in 2010. If you think Square Enix wasn't looking at the monstrous growth of that game throughout the life cycle of Wings of the Goddess and wondering how to capture some of that success, you'd be naive. While 11 was losing players in this time period, so was almost every other MMO, as World of Warcraft became an unstoppable force in the MMO market share. All of this is to say that while the incompetence and split resources may have been a necessary element of why 11 changed, they weren't sufficient. If we were betting on why exactly 11 changed, I would bet on the one game that changed everything. One of the most common complaints that I heard about Wings of the Goddess is that it didn't add much to the game. It did add many new zones, but almost every new zone was just a slightly changed variant of the zone from the base game. It added 2 new jobs, but at the time, those jobs did not have nearly the impact on the game that Blue Mage and Corsair did. And as for the endgame content the game did get, most of the notable additions were implemented to flesh out the gameplay loop of Treasures of Adargon, such as Nizzle Isle, the Zenny NM system, and mythic weapons. And the gameplay content added to the gameplay loop of Wings of the Goddess? There was Campaign, the Stronghold Notorious Monster system, and after a couple years, the Allied Note NM system. While Campaign was received well, both NM systems would prove to be forgettable. With a little exception, most of the endgame was still focused around the previous expansion. Wings of the Goddess was the first expansion that had not had a substantial impact on the endgame even after a couple years past its release. So what is it like to play this bare-bones expansion today? Well, since I played the content in order of release, Wings of the Goddess is the first time I felt overwhelmed with how many new things there was to do. Treasures of Adargon gave a ton of new content, but the sheer amount of content you gain access to by progressing the Wings of the Goddess missions is really staggering. The way this expansion's new jobs have developed in the meta perfectly summarize the modern perspective on the gameplay loop. Both Dancer and Scholar have become highly valuable in the modern endgame. Dancer is a flexible support job that is capable of incredible damage output, and Scholar has become a less stressful version of White Mage, thanks to the different approach it takes to healing. While Scholars aren't replacing White Mages outright, the flexibility they do offer make them well suited for plenty of other content. However, there isn't a lot of awareness for just how great these jobs are in the modern endgame setting. Many modern and returning players tend to overlook these 2 jobs. But just as these jobs are overlooked, so too are the ties that the story missions have to all of the varied content in this era. The first content piece I noticed was an NM system called Voidwatch. This NM system probably isn't actually Wings of the Goddess content, but we'll get to that. Voidwatch requires traveling back and forth between the past and present, which is a mechanic that the opening mission of Wings of the Goddess gives access to. Out of all of the NM systems I've played, this was the most streamlined and polished. Upon participating, you receive a series of key items that you can upgrade by popping NMs with Void Stones, which you can get from certain Voidwatch NPCs. You can also modify the way you fight these NMs for extra rewards as well. Of all of the non-Abyssea NM systems added in this era, Voidwatch is definitely the most elaborate NM system, with its own storyline, ultimate NM called Provenance Watcher, and unlockable zone, and I found the system to be very enjoyable. After progressing further into the missions, I unlocked another zone, the beauty of which rivals that of Altair. And after finding another entrance to this same zone, I gained access to the Walk of Echoes battlefields, which may also not really be related to this expansion, but we'll circle back to that. In this content, you can fight through 15 different battlefields, or walks, separated into 7 tiers of difficulty. Upon defeating a walk, there is a chance for that same battlefield to become surged, where the difficulty increases along with the value of its rewards. This content dropped certain types of currencies, which led me to discovering the Magian Trials. The Magian Trials are actually a system used to upgrade a large amount of gear beyond just this era. At least it is now. Discovering this, though, led me to finding out about the Empyrean weapons, which are a third ultimate weapon type, or Rima, in the game today. Upgrading these weapons requires participation in yet another type of content, the Voidwatch NM system. In this NM system, you fight an invisible monster type that is emerging from the cavernous maws. The catch is, they are invisible. There is a little minigame associated with getting these NMs to appear that I found to be quite fun. Voidwatch is a little like Voidwatch in that the central activity you're doing is upgrading a key item. The method of upgrading this key item, however, was a little more monotonous for me. But those who stick it out get to fight Yilbegon, the ultimate NM from this system. These are far from being the only content in this expansion. Beyond these, Wings of the Goddess also has the Allied Note Notorious monster system, which is a bit like the Imperial Standing NM system, except the fights are in open world areas instead. You purchase an item with Allied Notes that allows you to enter certain open world fights. There is also the Stronghold NM system, which fleshes out the chain of command for the beastmen you fight in Campaign. Campaign is yet another type of battle content that is split between activities. Campaign battles and campaign operations. These are a bit reminiscent of Besiege and Assault, respectively, from the last expansion. Campaign rewards experience points and Allied Notes, the same currency used in the Allied Note Notorious monster system. There is also a system for upgrading your rank in Campaign. Another type of battle content is Legion, which rewards you with a special currency for battling through chambers of NMs. There are some really good items that you can purchase with these Legion points, and a couple farmable drops that are still really profitable on the auction house today. There is also pseudo-recreational content added in this expansion, such as Meeble Burrows and Moblin Mazemonger, which I spent a lot of time enjoying. I'm not going to elaborate on all of this content because I don't think it would add much to our discussion. Suffice it to say, Wings of the Goddess gives you an enormous plethora of ways to enjoy the game, dozens of goals to work towards, and dizzying amounts of content. And therein lies the fourth and final thing you need to know to understand the truth of Wings of the Goddess. The expansion that added the least amount of content is also the expansion that has the biggest and most comprehensive spread of content pieces in its modern gameplay loop. But how does any of this make sense? If it added no content, how can it also have the most content? This is where things get complicated. The flow of content eventually led me to Abyssea, an entirely different mini-expansion from Wings of the Goddess. Some of the content I discussed came out before Abyssea, and others came out afterward. Despite the expansion leading me to everything I've discussed, many veteran players don't consider content like Voidwatch, Walk of Echoes, or Legion to be part of this expansion, and they have good reasons for thinking this too. If Abyssea marks the beginning of a different era, then many of the content pieces I just discussed might not be Wings of the Goddess. All of this begs the question, what is Wings of the Goddess? This sounds like a ridiculous question, I know. One with a simple answer, right? Any content that came out before Abyssea is Wings of the Goddess, and afterward is Abyssea-era content. Great. But that doesn't make a lot of sense, because the content pieces that came out during the launch of Wings of the Goddess seamlessly lead into certain content pieces that came out after Abyssea. Alright then, anything included into the gameplay loop of Wings of the Goddess content is part of Wings of the Goddess. But hold on, it makes more sense to divide the content based on what level cap it was designed for. Abyssea raised the level cap to 99, and the content after Abyssea adhered to this level cap. Okay, sounds great. Level 75 content is Wings, and level 99 content is Abyssea era. But to divide things up this way means you're excluding certain content pieces that were included in the purchase of Wings. We're clearly not getting anywhere. It's time to ask some veteran players. One veteran player says to divide things up by the level cap. That makes sense. But like I said, that also excludes certain content pieces which were included in the purchase of Wings. Another veteran player says that only the content that was released at launch of Wings of the Goddess is Wings content, which excludes a majority of the expansion's story too. Another says that everything in this time frame is Wings, and the add-ons, they're just paid DLC for this expansion. Even if this paid DLC was more transformative for the game than any other expansion before, except for Rise of the Zilart? I don't know. There might not be a community consensus on this question. And if you don't like the way I've categorized the content for this video, I do apologize. But I grouped the content the way I did because this was the path I took to discover all of this content. Ultimately, the way content is grouped between the Wings era and the Abyssea era and post-Abyssea era doesn't matter at all, and all of these complications might even strengthen my point. Even if none of the content discussed, from campaign to Voidwatch, is actually Wings content, that doesn't change the fact that this expansion still guides players through the largest and most varied set of content in the game. Regardless, this conversation about what constitutes Wings of the Goddess isn't the only conversation that elicits some division in the 11-player base. Almost every conversation about this expansion plays out this way to some extent. Some take the side of this expansion's story being the worst and most fragmentary. Others, and myself, claim it to be the best in the game. Some say that the expansion is monotonous and archaic. Others say that it aged the best of the 75-era expansions. Throughout my time discussing this expansion with the 11-player base, I was struck with an epiphany. Yes, this epiphany led me to discover the truth of this expansion. The truth that you, dear viewer, are now ready to learn. The truth that has been hidden for 16 years. These contradictory conversations about Wings of the Goddess were incredibly reminiscent of another set of conversations I've had in the Final Fantasy community. Many criticisms 11 players level against Wings of the Goddess are the same exact criticisms leveled against Final Fantasy XI by the broader Final Fantasy fanbase. Many players in the Final Fantasy fanbase sound identical to those who take issue with Wings of the Goddess. They claim that the story is fragmentary and uninteresting. They completely overlook the soundtrack and its achievements. They claim that the gameplay and gameplay loop don't live up to the other installments. These are just the beginning of the similarities between Wings of the Goddess and the game that it's a part of. The Final Fantasy XI player base claimed that playing Wings of the Goddess in its era was a horrible experience, just like Final Fantasy fans say about Final Fantasy XI. It's said that they didn't get the proper attention from its developer. Many claim that the golden era of Final Fantasy ended around 11, just like the golden era of 11 ended around Wings of the Goddess. Many returning players have gotten caught up and played through all of the story, except for Wings of the Goddess, just like many Final Fantasy fans played all of the mainline games except 11. The truth about Wings of the Goddess is that it is the Final Fantasy XI of the Final Fantasy XI expansions. Both carry issues and imperfections due to how they've changed over the years. Both dissatisfied many players during their time, and both faltered in similar and unfortunate ways. But for the same reason I think Wings of the Goddess is the best that Final Fantasy XI has to offer, thanks to its great story, incredible characters, and diversity of side content, I also think that Final Fantasy XI is the best that the Final Fantasy franchise has to offer, thanks to its phenomenal story, wonderful characters, and immense library of content. Wings of the Goddess is the pinnacle of Final Fantasy XI, and its inclusion, no matter how damaging, forever improved the game it's a part of, and the franchise that it's in. I want to reiterate something. These are my opinion, and my opinions are often wrong. If you are a harsh critic of Wings of the Goddess, we may disagree, but there's nothing wrong with that. I fully realize my perspectives are heavily biased due to being a new player. And this, by the way, might also be the best answer I got to what truly constitutes Wings of the Goddess, in case you were wondering. Furthermore, I want to thank some of the people who greatly helped in the making of this video. First of all, I wanted to thank Corvana for all of the 11 footage. I wasn't able to replay all of the paths to capture footage for this video, so having a wonderful resource like Corvana's collection of 11 cutscenes really made this video possible. In addition, I'd like to thank the Reddit users Celestliat, Ectothermia, and Topyash for all of the information you provided while I was revising the script. It was a tremendous help. There are some others I'd like to thank too, and they're both here on YouTube. There were 3 content creators that convinced me to try this game. The first was Basic Guardian, who I mentioned in the first video. The second is Ruamoko. He's done an enormous amount of content for 11, including lore videos, job guides, and more. I probably spent hours watching and rewatching your lore videos, and each one cultivated my curiosity for the story till I broke down and bought the game. Thank you for those videos. Next is Gwavith, who made a new player guide right before I started playing the game. This is one of the guides that convinced me that I'd survived the learning curve for this game, and I constantly went back to it for answers. Thank you for making it easier for us newer players to get started. Finally, thank you, dear viewer. I assure you, no view, like, or comment goes unappreciated.